Aloha, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for Civil Beat's Ideas Live show for Wednesday, July 28th, 2021. We're so glad to have you with us for today's discussion on tourism. Our show today is entitled, Is Tourism Broken? And Where Do We Go From Here? It's the second in a series of conversations that we're hosting on tourism. And today we are extremely grateful to be joined by four people who we are really looking forward to hearing from. We have Derek Kawakami with us here from Kauai. Derek has been the mayor of Kauai since December of 2018. Thank you so much for being here with us. We have John DeFries with us here. John has been the president and CEO of the Hawaii Tourism Authority since September of 2020 and was formerly the executive director of the Native Hawaiian Hospitality Association. Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. We have Colin Moore here today. Colin at the University of Hawaii is the chair of the School of Communication, as well as the director of the university's Public Policy Center and an associate professor. And it was Colin's essay, which he co-authored with John Knox and which we ran in Civil Beat earlier this month, that really helped to spark the conversation today. That essay was entitled, People Must Have a Real Voice in the Future of Hawaii Tourism. You can find it, we'll put a link to it in the chat of today's show, and you can find it on our Civil Beat website. And we have David Kimo Frankel is here with us. And Kimo was the chair of the Sierra Club's Hawaii chapter when it sued the HTA in 2000 over the HTA's failure to study the impacts of increasing tourism. And that was at a point when approximately 7 million visitors were arriving annually. As we know, in 2019, that number was up to 10.4 million. And then, of course, we all had the opportunity to experience what it would be like living without tourism when the pandemic came along and shut everything off and our visitor count dropped 97%. So I want to thank every one of you who's here with us today for being here, and to encourage you to send us any questions that you have for any of our panelists, any comments that you would like to share. Please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will be monitoring those as we go through our discussion today. But I really do want to thank each one of you for being here. And we kicked off this series a couple of weeks ago. We had a discussion called Global Perspectives on Tourism. And that featured someone from Aotearoa, New Zealand, from Holland, from the East Coast of the United States, and from Hawaii. And that conversation really took the big view. And at the end of that, the question that really emerged, and the question that I would like to start with today for each one of you is, why do we have tourism? If we really pull way back, who is benefiting? What is the purpose and why do we have it? So Colin, since you wrote the essay that sort of led to this conversation today, I wonder if you would start for us.
Sure. I mean, I think that the simple answer to that question is tourism was supposed to be the second industry of Hawaii as agriculture began to decline. Right after statehood, this was a conscious decision by the state to start developing resort areas. We had, of course, several before this period, but to develop more resort areas, particularly in the neighbor islands, to give Hawaii another industry after the anticipated decline of agriculture. Hawaii saw tremendous growth in its industry. I mean, part of this was due to the availability of safe commercial jet travel from the mainland. But it quickly skyrocketed to one of the very top tourist destinations in the United States. And a lot of this was done with relatively little state intervention. I mean, with the exception of building the infrastructure to allow the resorts to appear, there hadn't been a lot of direct tourism governance until relatively late. As viewers might recall, the HTA itself wasn't even established until 1998. So I think we've reached a moment in the history of this industry where it probably is time for more direct state governance.
Okay. Derek, can we turn to you?
Absolutely.
So what would you say about why do we have tourism? And it doesn't necessarily even, that question wasn't so much thinking about, although I really appreciate the history, Colin, the sort of factual reason that tourism exists, but if we think of it more in terms of its value to us, who's benefiting from it? Why have tourism?
For me, it's simple. If you break it down to, I would say, uh, around my age demographic, and if you were to ask somebody, it's jobs. I mean, if you ask who's the beneficiaries of the visitor industry, it's many of my friends. And it's not just people that are working in the resorts. I grew up in the grocery industry, and I can tell you, big save markets, we definitely saw a trend up and down with what the visitor industry was doing, but it also trended up and down on how much building permits are issued. See, my dad was pretty much a smart guy in the sense that he would use metrics that were out of the box to sort of determine what direction, what sort of product mix we were going to hold, where were visitors, shopping at. And I would say, at this point in time, for somebody like myself that has probably seen sort of the wheels of the visitor industry really catch momentum and see a lot of hotels come up, but has not been around long enough to see Kauai where there was no visitor industry. I would say for most people, it's jobs. I would say the beneficiaries are people that are vacationing here, but also people who have been able to make a living. And I think the perception is it's harder and harder for people that work in the visitor industry to actually make a living, because a lot of these workers have to hold perhaps another job. And that's just, it's a rising cost of living. I wouldn't put it on any industry's back. I would say part of it is government. Part of it is we got to do a better job. But that's my answer to the question.
Okay. Mahalo. John, what would you say really is the reason for tourism?
I identify with both what Colin and Derek said. It kind of mirrors my life. I started in the industry working for a company called AmFac, which was a sugar giant that transitioned into hospitality and hotel ownership. Really gave birth to my career in tourism on Kauai at Coco Palms Hotel. But let me say this, that in answer to whether this is broken or not, it's, I go back to a health and wellness adage where we don't have to be sick to get well. And the industry is doing exactly what it was designed to do over time. And does it have to recalibrate? Absolutely. Is that recalibration underway? Absolutely. I think the legislation that came out in the form of 862 is a signal in that direction. I think some of the repositioning here at HTA that preceded my arrival, that a board strategic plan back in January of 2020, I thought began to take a much more comprehensive and holistic look at the industry. In terms of benefit, I agree with Derek that the jobs that have been created are probably ranked, highest in what benefit. But should there be other community benefits? Absolutely. And I'm hoping we can extend the conversation in that direction.
Okay, mahalo. Kimo.
I slightly disagree with Mayor Kawakami. While I recognize that there are many folks who benefit with jobs from tourism, the primary beneficiary of tourism are multinational corporations that own the hotels, that manage the hotels, and that own the land that the hotels sit in. They take the money from tourism out of this state and bring that money back to their shareholders in, whether it's on the mainland or Japan or what have you. They are the primary beneficiaries. More of the money goes to them, if you look at things holistically, economically, than it does to people who work in tourism. And that's why we have tourism. The multinational corporations and the folks they hire are very successful at lobbying elected officials to promote their interests. And it is their interests that are being served.
Okay. And so I hope one of the things actually that we can get to in this conversation, maybe to talk about some of the profits in tourism, what we know about the profits in tourism, how much money is being made and where that money is actually going. But one of the things I wanted to ask about is we hear a lot about these days is over tourism. You know, this is kind of a word that has come up. It's a kind of concept. People really feel like we're at the point of over tourism. And I wonder how each of you would define that, because I think that's, you know, that we had a group who were participating in the last conversation that we had that was, it was called ETA, Enough Tourists Already. And they said, we're a group of 2,400 and growing by the day, united by the belief that over-tourism is killing our islands. So that's a perspective that's out there. But when I hear this term over-tourism, I wonder, how should we be defining that? And John, I would love to ask you, what does over-tourism mean? What is that?
Sure. Well, I think, you know, it's a very personal response that you'll get from different people, but fundamentally, it's the overcrowding of visitors to our islands that are congregating in certain areas that at certain times of the day that deprive kind of the enjoyment that local residents would ordinarily have. And there are hotspots on every island where it's predictable, where there's infrastructure that is undersized for the level of traffic and visitor and local traffic that is occurring on any given time. But essentially, we've got in many areas 220 volts going into a 110 volt circuit. And if you keep doing that, you will fry the circuit. Laniakea is such on Oahu is such a place. I think one of the better solutions has appeared on Derek's Island at Haena. And I think that different communities, along with state and county agencies, are beginning to address ways in which those situations can be remedied.
Derek, can you tell us what's happening at Haena?
Well, what's happening at Haena is Haena underwent a makeover, sort of say. We were able to utilize the floods in 2018 to really take an area that was mismanaged, to me, a place that really reflects what Kauai living is all about. You had a small, tight-knit community that was very beautiful, so beautiful that everybody in the world wanted to be a part of it. And if you don't have management of these special places and there's no controls, enforcement, systems, and process, it starts to, I think, get to the question that you asked, what is over-tourism? And to me, it's that point where it starts to erode away at the quality of life for people that have lived here our whole lives, where it becomes unbearable. And you start to see sentiment start to turn, where even some of the visitor industry workers have a negative taste in their mouth when it comes to the industry that provides them jobs. To me, it's very simple. You cannot use occupancy rates, right? You have to look at our carrying capacity. And I think what happened at Haena is everybody was able to come together, which once in a blue moon, the stars align and the county and the state and the industry and the community comes together to say, what is the best path forward to having the ability to coexist? And really, that's what happened at Haena. And people have to keep in mind, it's a work in progress. There's additional things that will pop up. Who is going to enforce the illegal parking? Because we found out that having a very high fine and signage, quite frankly, is not enough. And so there's things that need to be worked out. But at the crux of the matter, going through the pandemic, many people seeing that, oh, wow, the visitor industry does contribute to traffic. Now we're looking at transportation systems. We're looking at non-resident parking fees. We're looking at potentially having to close some campgrounds periodically to be able to let the area rejuvenate and come back. And so we're looking at how we can learn from disasters to address other disasters and avoid future disasters. So we're learning all around.
Okay. Okay. Colin, is there anything you want to add about over-tourism, about how you feel that should be defined? I know that the Public Policy Center was involved in doing a survey looking at tourism and looking at specifically public ideas around tourism and over-tourism.
Sure, Julie. I mean, I agree with what's been said. I mean, and you can define over tourism as just simply exceeding the capacity of the island's infrastructure to manage that number of people, or just the effect far too many people have on very specific places. Like, for example, here on Oahu, Maunawili Falls, that hike is often singled out as a particularly tough spot. We asked this question in our survey, and when we posed the question, would you like the absolute number of tourists to go down, or would you like limits on tourism? A slight majority of people agreed with that, but actually when we gave people the option and said, well, what about if we mainly focused on these overcrowded areas, these particular hotspots, better management there? Is that really what you're interested in? And from our survey results, that seems to be what people care about. I mean, part of this is due to the fact that there are a lot of tourists as a result of social media, Airbnb, vacation rental units, a lot of people in places they never were before, where we haven't developed the infrastructure to manage them. So I think when you dig into this, it's not that people are so concerned about tourists in Waikiki. They're concerned about tourists in Kailua, and places where there isn't the parking or capacity to manage them. And there's a solution to that. I mean, there's several solutions. We can improve our destination management capacity. We can build more infrastructure. I mean, there's lots of ways to manage these things. And so when you start presenting these as options to people, increasing fees, for example, developing online reservation systems like they've recently done with Hanauma Bay, residents are really responsive to those concrete solutions.
Right. Kimo, I'd like to bring you in here to hear your thoughts on over-tourism, and maybe connected with that, you want to talk about the lawsuit that you were involved in with the Sierra Club against the HTA back in 2000.
Okay, sure. So I think Colin's answer is fine, but it's a bit naive. Yes, we need to focus in on what they call the hotspots, but my concern is that the HTAs and Colin's focus on that distracts from the bigger picture. It is clear we cannot handle as a state more than 7 million tourists a year. I'd even venture to say 6. And yes, you can look at hotspots. You can talk about, but talking about that allows people to ignore the big picture in terms of, do we have enough water? Can our roads handle it? Not just Lanikai Road, but the H1 freeway. How's our electric grid on all the islands? Can that handle the tourism? Can we solid waste, sewage? I mean, there is a litany of issues that are not confined to a specific hotspot. And I think, if you look at the data and you look at people's concerns, it was after we increased from 7. The Sierra Club raised the concerns basically around between 6 and 7 million back in 2000 when the lawsuit was filed regarding the failure of the Hawaii Tourism Authority to study the impacts of increasing tourism. And what we've seen is exactly what the Sierra Club said was going to happen, that there are increasing problems. So there is a number. That's not a magic line in and of itself, because you also have to deal with specific places. But I think there is broad scale consensus that we are beyond the point at which tourism is at a level that people are willing to accept.
So maybe we could talk about that, because it seems like this idea of setting some sort of a limit is very much a part of the conversation these days. We hear the terms carrying capacity. We hear people talking about how many people should come, should not come. And then a lot of secondary issues connected with that. Is it even legal to set up something like that? Who should enforce it? How would it be done? We saw a comment on Peter Apo's article today about, well, if you just close down a number of gates at the airport, not so many planes could land. Maybe that's a way that you could do it, kind of do an end run. But I guess I'd like to ask each one of you what you really think about the feasibility of trying to set a hard number, draw a hard line and say, for example, on Kauai, well, we're going to have X number of people come and that's it.
Yeah, I think in a sense we've moved in the direction of doing that, and I say that because, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, but roughly, if you look at the inventory of Kauai's accommodation units, it's about 30% hotels, 30% timeshare, 30% vacation rentals. So that gives you a good indicator that we want visitors to stay in resort areas, because from a mayor's standpoint and a delivery of services standpoint and infrastructure standpoint, they're easier to manage. I really think what caught people off guard were these vacation rentals that were popping up unbeknownst to anybody and operating illegally, either known or unknown. It was just an issue of supply and demand. So Kauai really led the way with our planning department and our council to establish an ordinance that basically created that's it. If you're outside of the VDA and you've been operating, and granted you've been paying your GE and TAT, that gives you the ability to come in and apply for a non-conforming use certificate, and that's it. And that wasn't the end of it. We had to go and talk to the Airbnbs, the Expedias, have them understand what we're trying to accomplish, and we pulled them in the office and we shook hands, and at the end of the day, Airbnb and Expedia had told us, hey, we get it. We understand what you folks are trying to do. We respect it. We will do everything we can to work with your planning department that properties that are on our platform actually have a non-conforming use certificate or are actually in the VDA. And I really think that is the first step to really taking a look at carrying capacity and managing the visitor industry, is to make sure that we're managing sort of the vacation rental units that can pop up. And if nobody's looking, it can create some big issues, because 30% of our inventory are vacation rental units. Many of them are in residential areas. That is where we hear the biggest complaints. And so that's really the direction we took as a first step to start, one, controlling, but then also we started raising property tax rates on the vacation rental market itself. We said, look, if it looks like a resort, acts like a resort, they should be taxed accordingly and pay their fair share.
Okay. John, what does the HTA think about the vacation rentals? What's the HTA's position? What would you like to see happen?
Visitors belong in master planned resort destinations. They don't belong in our communities. And the emergence of the illegal accommodation in particular, none of us want a new neighbor every 7 days. And that's what's occurring. They're showing up in our neighborhoods where they don't belong. They're showing up at our commercial complexes that are getting overrun at times. And so each county is having to make some really tough decisions on, basically purging from their islands the illegal accommodation, and we would support that. But I do want to go back. I think what's important about what Kimo is raising is the difference between cause and effect, right? We can spend the next 40 minutes talking about all the effects that this is creating, but there are some causal issues here that need attention, and they need sound public debate, and they need sound public policy. The capital groups, who are the major asset owners here, have done nothing illegal. All they've done is they had the capital, they made the acquisition, and they're operating. And it started with the real estate, started with the improved asset, and then they found credible and trusted management companies that have global brands to manage their assets, right? So if we want to start, and I reflect on it when Kimo was saying that, I went back to when I started in the industry in '73. There were a number of locally owned hotel companies, transportation companies, airlines, and these, proliferated the industry. And now, 49 years later, I can only think of like one Kauai family that owns a hotel, right? And so Hawaii really is, as the challenge that lays ahead for us is, are we prepared to kind of re-envision where we want to be in 20, 30 years, and what steps do we have to take now to get our arms around this? Because it is a free enterprise system. We're subject to those forces. Things like capacity, right? It always saddens people to learn that the US Constitution protects people's rights to move, citizens of the US, to move freely between states. And that protection is embedded in the Constitution. So things like trying to put a cap on visitor arrivals, while conceptually we can talk about it, the actual implementation and executing something like that is quite different.
So, Julia, if I can chime in here. So you're right. We can't pass a law that says we're not going to have 6 million or 10 million tourists a year. But there are actually a number of things that we can do to effectively bring down the number of tourists very easily and effectively. Number one, reduce the money spent on marketing tourism. Thankfully, the legislature did that this year. We don't need to be spending our taxpayer money marketing. Number two, we shouldn't be authorizing any more hotels or timeshares being built in the state. We have enough hotels, we have enough timeshare units, no more. It's simple to do. Number three, and we don't need HTA to do this, we need the city councils to do it. Number three, don't permit any more vacation rentals or B&Bs on most of the islands. I think the Big Island can tolerate more, but certainly not Maui, Kauai, or Oahu. Number four, increase property taxes on houses that are not owner occupied. Number five, no authorization for more housing that serves second, third, or fourth homes for people. And I'm referring to places like in Kaka'ako or Hokulia. We don't need to be allowing for developments that are clearly not for local people. It is obvious what these developments are, and all we need to say no to them, and it's very easy to do that. We need to cap the number of rental cars. If we cap the number of rental cars, which we can do legally, it will effectively limit how many tourists can come to Hawaii. We need to increase the tourism tax. If we increase the price of coming to Hawaii, there will be fewer people that come. And as a part of that, we need to mandate that all hotels, B&Bs, vacation, whatever they're called, include the price of all taxes in their advertised rates. That can be done legally. So all the resort fees, all the taxes, everything, so that there's no sticker shock at the end. People see up front how expensive it is going to be to come here, and that will limit the people. You do all these things, you will reduce the number of folks coming here, and you'll generate more revenue that can pay for the impacts that tourism has, whether it's on social services, or natural resources, or infrastructure.
Yeah. I just want to kind of highlight that one of the things that was a pretty serious idea during the pandemic was the idea of potentially taking some hotels out of the tourism market and transforming them into housing units, because there's such a shortage of housing units. So that's just another idea that's been floated. I guess in terms of where we go next in this conversation, I'm just thinking about the nuts and bolts of who has the responsibility to come up with these ideas and really cement them and put them in place. And I know that HTA has been working on these destination management action plans. And I think, Derek, you've probably been involved in that, and John. And it seems like it would be important to tell the viewers about those, because those seem to be a fairly significant sort of part of the idea of management going ahead, at least from the HTA perspective. John, can you speak to those destination management action plans?
Not only will I speak to it, but let me put it in an added context. The birth of that planning process goes back to calendar year 2019, when HTA staff, prior to my arrival at HTA, but HTA staff and a team of planning consultants actually went island to island, really to listen and to heighten and increase the voice of communities about what the future of tourism would be. And after completing that process, actually drafted a new strategic plan that was adopted by the HTA board January of 2020, that basically is built on 4 pillars: natural resources, Hawaiian culture, community, and branding. And as a member of the lay public, when I saw that, I was encouraged because for me at least, it looked like the HTA board was taking a much more holistic look at tourism. If somebody said, identify the 4 pillars when you entered the industry back in the 70s, the 4 pillars would have been hotels, airlines, rent-a-cars, and attractions, right? Something like that. So I really saw that as a good faith effort for the industry to try and catch itself, because already in calendar year 2019, there were indications that the infrastructure was being tested, that the number of visitors was beginning to infringe upon what Derek touched on earlier, the sense of community well-being. And so that plan got put into place. What got disrupted was the rollout of that, which would have been a rollout to the general community, the visitor industry, the legislators, to keep building upon it. However, when I stepped in September, I inherited that plan. Part of it is a destination management action planning process, where each county, through its steering committee, is brought together to identify the priorities, the hotspots, the potential solutions. These are very difficult discussions to have because the group is extremely diverse. The school teacher will see it very different from the hotel worker, and it's intended to be that tense. Actionable items for year 1, 2, and 3 are identified in each of those reports, as well as funding increments that HTA will forward for that purpose. So we've completed that for Kauai, Maui Nui, which includes Molokai and Lanai, Hawaii Island, and in the next several weeks, the Oahu plan will be made public. And we're using those plans as a framework for getting our arms around some of these troubled areas and hotspots in particular.
But I guess the question is, how is that going to lead to actual change? And I don't know if you want to continue, John, or Colin, we haven't heard from you in a little while. I don't know if you want to come in again, referencing back to the survey.
Well, I mean, so our survey shows that there's a lot of, openness to ideas that Kimo was mentioning earlier, but I want to pick up on something on what John has been talking about, because in my view, one of the problems is that HTA actually doesn't have very much power. I mean, it can advise, it can encourage, and I think what we really need to do is to have a more robust system of destination management and governance. That might mean something like elevating a similar position to HTA to the level of a cabinet position. Some have advocated for sort of tourism czar, because regulating tourism in the right way is incredibly complex. You have city and county or county regulations, you have state regulations, you have to deal with industry, you have to deal with concerned nonprofits. And I think HTA, certainly over the last few years in its shift to destination management, like John has said, has been trying their best, but their budget was just cut. They don't have a lot of independent authority. We need to implement this stuff in the right way. We need an agency that has some authority, that has the resources to do it, and to develop a strategic action plan that we can actually implement. Otherwise, you get kind of one-offs. We're working on, we have a plan for this area hotspot, we have a plan for this area hotspot, trying to understand what does it mean to limit the number of rental cars, which might be something we would want to do. How do we get all of these state agencies focused on managing tourism appropriately? And that requires an agency with some teeth, in my view. The other thing I think it requires, which we haven't done a great job, is involving more people in the way that HTA has done with the development of its destination management action plans, but maybe creating a tourism council. We tested this in our poll. There's a lot of support for this, even an elected tourism council. They're doing this right now in Barcelona in Spain, one of the cities that has been most affected, overrun by tourism. What they found is they have a citywide council that represents about a third of folks from nonprofits, from academia, from environmental groups, a third from industry, and they call it a debating society. This is where these ideas get aired, but then when they agree, they have an agency that actually can enforce some of what they agree upon. So I often feel like HTA gets a lot of blame, but the agency was started as a marketing agency. It doesn't have a lot of its own independent authority or power. And it's done an excellent job, I think, trying to shift away from marketing in recent years to take a more holistic view of the industry. But I think that's what we need. We need more of that. We need a sort of tourism czar if we're going to do this right.
That is absolutely ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Colin, we agree there's a problem, but for you to assert that that the HTA needs more power is absurd. HTA is dominated by the hotel industry. The HTA has historically, culturally, and economically had one purpose alone. That is not to manage tourism. It has been to increase the number of tourists. And if you think simply because a couple of good people have been appointed to the authority that we should now give it power, none of the ideas that are actually implementable are ones that constitutionally or legally HTA has anything to do with and shouldn't have. Limiting the number of rental cars is something both the county or the state can do. HTA does not need to be involved at all unless they want to do like a little study. But HTA is a big money suck. They get so much money to operate. Do you know that HTA gets more money to operate than the Department of Hawaiian Homelands gets a year? That is embarrassing. That is shameful. These guys do not need more money. They don't need any more power. If you want to have tourism controlled, we need our elected officials in the city council and in the state legislature to enact meaningful legislation. And by the way, they've started to do that. When you see what the Honolulu City Council did with vacation rentals, what you see what the legislature did with cutting the marketing budget and the entire budget of the HTA. But it is absolutely naive of you to think that we should empower the HTA to do more. We need those steps to be taken, but they don't need to be taken by the HTA.
So I want to go back to this idea of the paradigm of what really is going to be healthiest. That was definitely a point that came up when we looked at our global perspectives on tourism, because these issues of over-tourism exist all around the world. People are really grappling with this. You brought up the example of Barcelona, but Barcelona and Hawaii are in no way alone in this. So if we really look at creating a healthier paradigm, John, you were saying you don't have to get sick to get well necessarily, but how do we actually create something that looks better? And I want to actually reference a column that my colleague Chad Blair wrote that ran on July 18th, and it was entitled "A 30-Year-Old Rant on Hawaii Tourism Still Rings True." And in it, he quoted from Haunani K. Trask's essay, "Lovely Hula Hands, Corporate Tourism and the Prostitution of Hawaiian Culture." And I just want to repeat the quote that Chad pulled from Haunani K's essay. "Mostly a state of mind, Hawaii is the image of escape from the rawness and violence of daily American life. Our aina or lands are not any longer the source of food and shelter, but the source of money. Land is now called real estate rather than our mother, papa. The American relationship of people to land is that of exploiter to exploited. Beautiful areas once sacred to my people are now expensive resorts." So that's pulling way back, right? And saying, what has happened? What has happened? How have we gotten here? And is this really where we want to be? And so I guess, again, I invite each one of you from the best place to really speak to, in the ideal, what do we want from tourism? What does the ideal, that healthy state in which visitors come to the islands and it's working for all, what does that look like? John, can I come back to you on that?
Sure. And you know, I think that that article that Chad wrote was spot on. The timing was right. You know, going forward, for me personally, and I'll speak to my experience, right? Tourism for me was a college I never went to, and my experiences growing up in the industry, you know, I value. A year ago, when I decided to become an applicant for this, it's because I felt that the combination of the economic collapse, the suspension of visitor arrivals, was going to present a window of opportunity to stop some of this erosion that you're referring to in terms of cultural impacts, environmental impacts, and basically position this industry so that over the next 2 generations, some of the young leaders that I have the pleasure of working with right now can actually take this back to where it belongs. And where it belongs is a greater sense that that Waikiki is not just a place of recreation. Having been born and raised there, you know, from a 5-year-old kid, the priority was that Waikiki was a source of food, a source of medicine, and then third, a place of recreation, in that order. And our family home was 2 blocks off the beach. Coming back into this role now causes me to go back to that time. But doing that at the scale we are now faced with is presenting a number of challenges. But I actually believe that if we as the host, if we as the residents set standards in our public policy, in our planning efforts that demonstrate a real commitment to malama this aina and to malama the ocean and to malama one another, that the visitor industry will find is capable of finding its place under that. But that we as hosts need to take care of our own home and doing it in a way that can become instructive to what the visitor experience becomes, as opposed to decades of allowing the market to determine what that visitor experience is going to be.
And so I guess the question there is, it seems that the market has so much power. I want to share a comment from one of our viewers. This is from Elizabeth. She says, none of this matters unless government officials hold themselves and big business accountable. As hotels have been built over the years, no one in Hawaii government has required them to build sewage treatment plants, fix roads and electrical grids, and upgrade our public schools. Why not? The big winners are offshore developers and publicly traded companies. Now, of course, they do pay tax, and they pay a significant amount of tax. But can we, I've always been very curious about learning more about how the money really works in Hawaii tourism. Kimo, you talked about that. What do we know about the profits that the Hiltons and the Sheratons and the Hyatts and all of the big hotel companies are taking out of the islands?
You asking me?
I'm asking all of you. I just would like to know. And I'd like our viewers to know.
I mean, we know that, and I think it's important to realize the profits come in 2 forms. One, it's everyday profit of operating the hotel, but for a lot of them, it's buying it and then selling the hotel, and that is staggering how much money is made by investing in the land or the hotel, making improvements, operating it for a number of years, and then flipping it. That almost makes more money for that investor than operating it on a yearly basis for a number of years. But well, I'll leave it at that.
Anyone else want to comment on that question?
About the profits of the corporate hotel owners. I mean, I think John mentioned earlier, and this I see this as a significant problem, that we don't have very many local hotel owners anymore. And I think that contributes to some of the problems with this industry. The other thing I'd add is that we also don't know the costs of tourism, and we know how much money is generated in terms of tax revenue. On the hotel tax, that's about $600 billion. But we don't know the cost of water consumption, of energy consumption, of the emissions generated by rental cars, of urban waste, all of these things. If we need better measurement for a lot of this as well, so we can price it effectively. I mean, that we need more data, we need more tools to try to understand this industry so we can tax it and price it appropriately. I mean, and so that involves more research. And we need much more of that. I mean, to understand how to manage it effectively for the people who live here, which I think is the goal of absolutely everyone on this call and in the chat.
Yeah, that leads perfectly into a question that I think that we're all becoming more and more aware of. And that gets to climate change and the kind of increasing understanding that we have of the amount of CO2 emissions that the average person is producing by taking a flight out to Hawaii and taking a flight home. Actually, Civil Beat, Stuart Yurton did a story on this, looking at, he was looking at 2017, and it was 6.3 million tons of CO2 that was generated by people flying to the islands that year. So I guess it seems like another big piece of the puzzle that we're all starting to realize this is really bad for our environment. Do any of you know of any specific plans to try and account for that? Is anybody worried about that out there?
Julia, we have no choice but to go down that road immediately. And we're working in concert right now in framing it with the Hawaii Green Growth Initiative and the Aloha Plus Challenge, which was adopted in 2014 by the 4 mayors at that time and the governor, and that established goals in 6 different categories, renewable energy being one of them, waste management, workforce development. If you go to the Aloha Plus Challenge website, it'll outline it. From the time I was first introduced to that, I didn't know how those goals for the state and for each island could possibly be achieved without the visitor industry aligning itself with that. And so we're on the front end of it. In the next 60 to 90 days, you're going to hear about a sustainable tourism forum where private sector partners will come together to address this. Climate change is real. Sea level rise is real. As a kid growing up in Waikiki, I never heard the term king tides until about 4 years ago, right? And then when you look at Waikiki and the age of that infrastructure, it was built during a time when all the mechanical rooms were built in the parking garages. And so they're all subgrade to Kalakaua Avenue and very vulnerable to sea level changes like that. So, we have no choice but to go down that road, and we intend to go down there and get to the bottom of how we can explain what currencies are at fact beyond the cash that's involved in tourism. The currencies like fresh water, the quality of our ocean, the quality of our coral reefs, all of that need to be factored in to the equation. And we don't have that information now.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else on the panel who'd like to speak to this issue of climate change and air travel and the numbers of people? It's just another impact of the numbers of people coming.
I think it's an important issue. I want to tag on to what John just mentioned. In, I don't know the time frame, 20, 30, 40 years, Waikiki is going to be underwater. I mean, that's the projections we're seeing from the University of Hawaii. What underwater means is subject to some confusion. It could mean walking in water rather than swimming in the water, but it's not going to be like it is now. And Also, Honolulu is going to get a lot hotter. In fact, it's going to be unbearably hot, like it was, I think it was 2 summers ago, that it was so hot. And you know what? Tourists are not going to want to come. They're not going to want to come to Waikiki because it's going to be underwater. It's going to be too hot. So yeah, climate change is going to have a huge impact on tourism. And I know that's different from the original part of your question, Julia, but it's something we have to recognize.
Derek, I know Kauai has been a real leader in terms of clean energy. What's the feeling there in terms of the connection between climate change and tourism?
Well, and I was on the board of directors as the strategic planning chair of KIUC. I mean, that was really my first taste of being in elected office, where we really upped the ante as far as how much renewable energy we wanted to incorporate into our portfolio to generate energy on Kauai. And KIUC has been doing a stellar job as far as doing everything they can to get clean renewable energy online. I'm gonna say this, like, look, I'm a part of the problem. Look, I grew up in Hawaii, spent most of my years here on this rock, and it's a big world. And I will tell you, I would be lying if I didn't say that I live to see the world, and I get there by traveling through the air, which is, it has its consequences. But I would say that I think it boils down to everybody's personal responsibility. And I can tell you, as mayor, I get to see where we can be more efficient with waste management. Our county is the first county to incorporate in our West Kauai community plan, manage retreat, which is really telling people that this is what the studies are saying our shoreline is going to look like. And if you have any intention on building in these areas, there's going to be ways that you're going to have to mitigate the impending disaster when the sea levels rise to this level. Already in the Kapaa area, we're taking a look at what the modeling is showing us as far as sea level rise. As a surfer, I think as a surfer, we see it firsthand, and we are concerned. We're concerned because the ocean is our playground. It impacts everything from the surf breaks that we see that are changing, surf breaks that are going to be lost. And I think, in a community like Kauai, we're doing things like at the county level. We said before we take a hard line on polystyrene, we're going to lead by example and say, hey, all county departments are prohibited from using county funds to purchase single-use plastics, right? We're going to say it's hard to be hypocrites if we support an ordinance like this and we ourselves are still not marching to the beat of that drum. So I really think that as much as everybody wants to blame the visitor industry because it's an easy target, like let's be honest, right? Like the people that are defacing the comfort stations at our beach parks, they're not tourists, right? Some of the most heartbreaking things that I see on the island, right? And I can speak as mayor of Kauai, I can speak from Oahu, but what I see is a lot of the damage being done, right? People that are ripping up trails, right? Leaving big trenches are our own people. And so it's hard for me to just sit aside and say, hey, all of this is an impact of the visitor industry. Let me tell you, when the state had to shut down Polihale during the pandemic, it was because it was being desecrated by our own people who, yes, maybe we need to do more education about leaving a lighter footprint. But I think the point that I'm trying to get to is we got to lead by example, right? If we want visitors to come in and model a certain behavior, then we have to groom them by how we treat each other, right? By how we treat our own environment, and being open-minded enough to instead of yelling at people, pull them on the side and say, hey, buddy, what are you doing? When I go and visit places, my family and I just try to fit in, right? We go there, we watch, we look, we see how the locals are acting, we see what they're ordering, and we try to even like dress like them too, right? Like we don't want to stand out. And I think I'd be remiss if I just sat by on the side and said, like, hey, as a mayor, we all have a role to play. And but that's not to say that the visitor industry doesn't have a lot of work to do. And John knows this. And I think what proof in the pudding is Kauai Visitors Bureau, Sue Kanoho. They came out with a study that basically said we are over capacity. And I think the visitor industry itself has a vested interest, like what Kimo said. Like if we got traffic issues, you think visitors are gonna want to come here? If our goal is to be a premier destination and know what we're worth and charge people what we think we're worth, because God, we don't want to be a budget destination when we're not a budget place to live, right? Then we got to start managing these things. And I think the visitor industry is realizing that they have skin in the game, that if we are not special, if people come here and they're misled to think, wow, there wasn't traffic in the brochures, there wasn't all this negative public sentiment, on the videos, the radio ads, that they have the most to lose at the end of the day. And it all comes back to balance, right?
Yeah.
How do we strike the right balance? Because there are pros and cons, and there's much benefits that can come from the visitor industry. But if there's a negative public sentiment, it's really hard to highlight the good that can come out of it.
So that's a perfect segue into my last question. We've been going for almost an hour, and this will be the last question. I'd love to ask each one of you for your brief thoughts on it. When we did the show last week, we had a guest from Holland, Co Coens. He is a professor of new urban tourism. He talked about the tourism that has value to the place, and not just. Typically, we tend to think of tourists as they have value. It's an economic value. It's a monetary value. But he was saying is, what do you really want? How would you describe, if you think of this mythical tourist who is valuable to you, who you want to see showing up? What values does that person carry? What are they bringing with them? So, Colin, I'd like to start with just asking you if you could answer that. What is the good tourist for Hawaii?
Well, rather than giving my own opinion, let me give you what we found in our survey, because I think that's more important, what other people think, which is they want people who respect the land and culture. They want respectful visitors. They want to welcome people, but they want to do so, welcome people who want to give back to this place. And I think that's what we hope. I think that's what we could try to market for. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's one of these things that's easier said than done. And I think to do so, we also need some sticks in terms of regulatory authority and taxation to make sure that happens. I mean, it's not enough just to try to encourage a certain group of people to come. We also have to keep other people out through the way we price things and regulate it and manage it. But yes, that is overwhelmingly, when we asked people, that is one of the things they most are concerned about. They want respectful visitors. And so how we get at that is maybe a little difficult, but there's no question in my mind, overwhelmingly, that's what people are interested in. Those are the people they're interested in welcoming.
Okay. Kimo, what do you think? What does a tourist who actually has value to Hawaii look like?
I don't have a good answer. I think Colin's answer was great. I don't really have anything to add to that.
Okay. Derek, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's very simple. On Kauai, I mean, it boils down to respect, right? We're still a small enough island where if you're labeled as somebody that's disrespectful, whether you're a visitor or a local, or somebody that came in, it's like it's going to be known, and it's not going to sit well. I think we want a visitor that understands that you paying $400 a night doesn't entitle you to cutting the line or expecting anything that is in your mind as to what Hawaii should be like, right? It boils down to like how we travel as a family. We go there with no expectations that here is we are a part of a community, and we want to tread lightly. And if we can get by, nobody realizing that we're there, then we're successful visitors. We just want to support the community and be respectful.
Mahalo for that. John.
Yeah, I think the key word everyone is using is respectful. I would agree with that. People who are mindful that they are guests in somebody else's home. I would also want to see more visitors who come here to learn, because we have so much to share in all kinds of sciences, in all kinds of Hawaiian cultural traditions and practices and multicultural traditions and practices. I would also like to see more conferences and congresses that are geared on things like conservation and sustainability, but just having people who congregate for business purposes keeps them in sessions, out of our neighborhoods, off rent-a-cars, and it's an easier segment of our industry to manage. And but overall, regardless of what segment, I think being respectful and mindful to the people, the place, and our society is what I certainly envision.
Okay. I want to just extend my deepest thanks to each one of you for coming and being with us today, for your openness, for the time and the generosity with which you entered into this discussion. It was live. You had no idea what the questions were going to be, and you just came with so much openness. And I know I speak for all of the viewers when I say really a big mahalo, because these are not, it's not an easy subject right now. It's very challenging, and I know everyone will have benefited from hearing your thoughts today. So thank you so much for that. I also just want to let the viewers know that this is the second of our series of discussions on tourism. We'll have another Global Perspectives on Tourism Part 2, and then also Native Hawaiian Perspectives on Tourism. So you can look for those discussions coming up in the weeks ahead. Thank you so much for all of your comments in the chat and for the passion with which you come to this. And really, again, to all four of you for the aloha that you showed us by being here with us today. Thank you. Aloha, everyone.